Andy, welcome. It's really good that we get this opportunity to have a conversation about calling, how God is calling people in fresh ways across the church. And I know that you're here. Well, we're having this conversation because God put a fresh call in your life. Tell us, first of all, a little bit about yourself. Introduce yourself for those who don't know you.
Thanks, Bishop Paul. I mean, it's great to be here. Absolutely loving beginning to engage with Southern Nottingham and the Diocese and all the people here, the different contexts. I'm married to Liz. She's a teacher, assistant head, and I've also got three children, 2 boys and a girl, 14, 12 and 10. And my background's a bit of a mix. I've got a bit of a mixed background, I guess. Started off in the world of science, maths physics degree and then a physics PhD of all things, and ended up in the technical consultancy world. And then from there, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, in terms of the whole calling thing, but from there ended up doing youth work in a church, and that was the beginning of the journey towards ordained ministry. And the thing I've been doing for the last 15 years or so, I know, what is it, 12 years or so, almost 15, last 12 years or so, is working for St. Mellitus College. We sort of pioneered this model of training people on the job and equipping them and them learning as leaders, actually engaged in mission and ministry in the local context.
The time we're recording this, I mean, it's quite exciting, Andy, because Monday, this next Monday, is a big day for you. And are you going to be ordained bishop in York Minster? Tell us how you feeling about that.
Well, I mean, excited, very definitely excited, but also a little bit daunted, which I guess is no surprise. Waiting has been a big part of this whole process. Obviously, COVID-19 has rather complicated things along the way, and the consecration would originally, as you know, have been back in May, and so we've had to hold on for a little bit of time, waiting to see when this would come around. But I guess one of the things I've learned, and one of the verses I often go back to is that passage in Isaiah, which talks about those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. And so I think in this time of waiting, in this anticipation, expectation around being consecrated a bishop, there's been that sense of being pushed back onto that reliance on the Lord and waiting on the Lord in this time. Journey is often a big part of God calling any of us, isn't it? And often these things work themselves out over a period of time. There's always people that are part of that journey along the way who prod us and push us in particular directions at different times. So the other thing about God's call is not everything is always revealed to us at any one particular time, isn't it? So again, you see that again and again in the Bible. People are called, they feel really inadequate in many ways. They don't feel as though they've necessarily got the gifts or the capacity to take on what they believe God is calling them to. But those things emerge. We often say that God equips those that he's called, and those things emerge over time. And I guess that's been true for me as well. I mean, if you'd asked me as a teenager when I first came to faith, that was I going to end up as a bishop, I'd have sort of laughed you out of town, I think, probably. Back then I was a mathematician, degree with maths and physics, ended up in consultancy. So there was a number of steps and a number of phases from that initial point of coming to faith. It sounds like you were clearer about your call from a younger age in some ways, the call to ordained ministry, whereas it took me a lot longer to work that out, and it was over a number of years and a number of people who I encountered and engaged with during that time before I guess some of that call became clearer. But I can still pinpoint moments back in those first years of coming to faith where actually there was a significant sense of God at work powerfully in my life, but I couldn't have told you exactly what the call was to at that point.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting because we often say that everyone is called by God. I mean, that calling doesn't belong just for those being ordained. But it'd just be interesting to hear you maybe just to say something about, at this moment, then we can see, but Sarah's just bought me a cup of tea. Thank you.
need my own cup of tea delivery service here.
It's great. It's going to run up the road, bring you a cup of tea. But no, I think there's something about how we hear a fresh call because clearly you already had a living faith, and as you were living out your faith in a completely different workplace, as a consultant, and in a completely different sphere. But how you hear God's call afresh, even if it's not taking you out of your kind of 9-to-5 work, as it were, but is taking you into a new sort of season of service. I mean, how did you begin to sort of hear God stop calling you to stay where you were, living for him in that workplace, and starting to, well, for you initially it was to youth ministry, wasn't it? So, I mean, how did
ministry happen? Yeah, do you know, and I how God calls us is, and how God speaks to us is a really challenging thing to work out sometimes. And interesting for me, it wasn't. I didn't have a sort of. There was no flash of lightning moment, no Paul on the road to Damascus sort of redirection of life. So for me, it was a much more gradual process over a period of time. Because what was interesting was I totally loved my consultancy job, you know, and there was a real sense of calling to that job, but also to the ministry and mission opportunities that came up with the people that I encountered in that space. And there was some moments, particular relationships that had a real impact on me and on them within that context. So I guess it was, for me, it was a question of what was some of the underlying things that some of the passions, if you like, that God was laying on my heart that were really going to shape me for the longer term, through sort of the wider bits of life. So, I mean, I'd always had a love for people, I guess. I'd always really enjoyed working with people and seeing people discover their own gifts and what God was calling them to, and enabling them to be in places where they could flourish. And so ultimately there was this question of, when the opportunity came up to pursue the possibility around the youth ministry role, for me, it was trying to discern amongst the different gifts and the different ways that God had, given me a real sense of purpose and direction, which was the one that I needed to step into, just sort of test the calling, if you like. And I did the usual things you do. I talked to friends and family and people close to me and prayed. But I actually, for me, there was something about just taking an initial step of faith into the more full-time ministry role, rather than just doing ministry alongside other jobs, and to sort of test out this calling and to see how God would use that, and whether there would be a sense of being blessed in that place, any sense of fruitfulness. So it was in one sense, it was a real risk.
Yeah.
And actually, it took me a long time to say, okay, yes, I can really see that this is the right direction of travel, and God does seem to be in this. And so that then led on to ordination down the line. So it was a long process over a period of time with sort of steps along the way.
You started out as a youth worker. You're going to be involved in, as part of your role, in supporting the whole discipleship and ministry team, and some of the things around growing disciples, particularly around growing younger disciples. I mean, any insights that when you think about encouraging younger people to engage in not only faith but in hearing God's call, what's been your experience of that? What does that look like, and what have you learned over the years at St. Mellitus? Because a lot of people have come through who's relatively young in exploring their call.
No, that's right. I think culture is really important. No matter what the sort of tradition of the church, it's a culture which says actually there's a space here for children and young people. We really value them. We value what they bring to the community and to the congregation. So I think trying to build a sort of permission-giving culture for young people and for children is really important as well. And then I think that there's something about just calling things out in people. There's something.
How do you do that? I mean,
I think we've got to have our eyes open, sort of that sort of spiritual radar, if you like, for our communities and in our congregations. And I think this is true about people being called into anything really, lay leaders, young people, people who have got their calling is to the workplace, but there's something particular that God is wanting to lay on their heart about that calling.
So on that one, Andy, I mean, that's a really interesting one about that calling into the workplace, or the kind of where people are most of the time. Because one of the tensions I always feel with ordinations is that you kind of have this sense that the church is doing really well in affirming a call to an ordained ministry, and we give quite a lot of attention to preparing and equipping people for that sort of ministry. And then you've got this fantastic service that and we lay hands on and so on. But I'm often very aware that everyone else can look like they're spectators, and I'm often trying to find ways in the service to say, hey, none of us are spectators, we're all called. But are there things you think that, I mean, should parish churches, local churches be finding ways, should we as a wider diocese be finding ways of equally affirming, commissioning the call of people who are not going to be called by God to be ordained or to become a licensed lay minister, but are called as clearly and as boldly to be where God has placed them? And how could we do that better or differently, do you think?
I don't think it's one of the things we necessarily do very well as a church. I think it's good to acknowledge that we probably haven't done that as well as we might have wanted to. I was interested, of course, my wife Liz, married to Liz, and she's a teacher, deputy head, or an assistant head in a school with responsibility for safeguarding. And her vocation, she's been absolutely clear all the way along, her vocation, her calling is into that space, into the sort of kingdom building opportunities that presents. She's a brilliant teacher. She's very good at it. She's clearly gifted in that area. But I think she would say that the church has probably not been brilliant at times. They've probably been better at celebrating and supporting my call than they have been at sort of celebrating and supporting her call. So I think I've always been aware of that. How we solve it, I don't know. I think we clearly need to be talking a lot more about the sort of the normal Monday to Friday jobs that people do, celebrating that. Equipping and training people for those contexts as much as we are for the sort of church-facing context.
No, I think we've got so much still to learn and develop in this. But there are one or two churches I've come across where they work really well with some of the Sundays that are marked out for different things. So on Education Sunday, ask people who are working in education, whether that's teachers or governors or someone who's engaged with their local school or college, to say something in the service about what they do, and then to stand and be commissioned by the congregation for the work that they do for the Lord in those places. On a Sunday nearest St. Luke's, to pray for people in healthcare. And I just wonder whether actually we could go on being really creative about this and find ways during the course of the year, just to pick out opportunities to affirm people in their sphere of calling, so that there isn't any sense of a hierarchy of how God calls us. We're all called to be followers of Christ, but at the same time, actually really praying into what that might mean, and the courage that, whether it's in teaching or healthcare or business or in some other sector, that someone just feels that their ministry really matters to the local church. So I think we could go on.
Prayer as well. I mean, you just mentioned it there, didn't you? Praying for them. I mean, actually, we can be much more intentional about who we pray for and how we pray when we gather as Christians, and actually being, again, not just praying for the stuff that's the church ministry, but praying very particularly into what's going on in the world and to those that are on sort of the front line.
And I love what's happened with the development of the real life course, because I think that's as the title says, it's about the kind of, what does it mean to live the Christian life where you are, both in your local church and where you spend your life, family, community, workplace. And it's amazing the way that's developed over the last few years, and 400 or 500 people now have been on that program, and it's starting up again this autumn, and it's a great place, I think, for people to not only to explore their calling, but also to feel that the church is helping to equip them theologically for what they do in their workplace and in other spheres of life.
And of course, I mean, that obviously, as you'll be aware, is very close to my heart, having been involved with something like this, and equipping people theologically, both lay leaders as well as those that are ordained, I think is vital. That enabling people to answer the sort of apologetic questions that so many people in the workplaces, in the pubs, at the football ground, wherever it is, when we're allowed to get back to some of those places, but equipping people to be able to engage about faith in the public square is clearly really important, and an important part of then helping people to think through what they're called to and how they're equipped for what God's calling them to there. So I suspect there's lots more we could do on that as well.
And there's a great thing at the moment where so much of the church's activity, at least, is having to be reshaped around the restrictions that the coronavirus creates, and that's constantly changing. But also, I just love the fact that we've got your ordination next week, and we're ordaining 20 new deacons and priests and licensed lay ministers a few weeks later.
It's going to be a busy few weeks.
It's going to be amazing. And isn't it great? It's just a reminder that there are no restrictions, certainly no COVID restrictions, on the way God is calling his church and calling people. And I just love the fact that just waiting to see what God is going to do. I'm just quite excited to see what new callings God is going to lay on individuals and lay on his church. And so we've got the next 2 or 3 weeks to celebrate that with all these people who are going to be ordained and licensed and sent out in different ways. So, hey, it's been really good to talk. And really look forward to being in York on Monday.
Really
and
excited about Monday.
Yeah, it's going to be so exciting. And then we've got a marathon of ordinations ahead of us the following weekend.
I've got to learn how to ordain people.
After 9, the thing is, it's a bit like when people get to preach, but they don't get to preach very often. You kind of, when you do something more regularly, you kind of learn faster. So 9 ordination services, Andy.
We'll be experts by the end of it.
It will be a joy, and it's great to have you here, and I'm just thrilled to see all the people God is going to be calling in new ways across our churches to be a part of what God has got in store and for the future, and so pleased that we don't have to worry about restrictions on the calling of God's people.